Well, welcome everyone. I think that in the interest of getting everyone back to their class routines in time for the 1 o'clocks or lunch, depending on what your agenda holds for you this afternoon, we'll go ahead and get started. First, let me say welcome and thank you for coming to the Constitution Day Forum for 2011. Today, we are gathered to celebrate the anniversary of the signing of the American Constitution, which took place on September 17, 1787, which, if my math is right, makes this the 224th anniversary tomorrow. I thought we'd probably get a better crowd today, so thus the arrangement. Over each of the past several years, my name is John Carter, by the way, if you don't know me. I teach history and political science here at the college. And you can find me up on the top floor at T. Berry Smith Hall if you want to come and visit when you're up there. I'm always pleased to spend time with students that are interested in constitutional history. Over each of the past several years, I've used this occasion to invite audiences to consider one or another of the less well understood facets of our constitutional history. Since I teach constitutional law, among other things, I get something of a feel for, what the college student level of knowledge is that gets renewed, on a regular basis. And so today, I'm going to try to continue in that tradition by exploring with you the evolution of America's systems of checks and balances with regard to formulation and direction of foreign and national security policy. Now, checks and balances typically is a concept that most people think they're familiar with, at least from high school, civics perhaps, but just for review. Checks and balances refer to the Constitution's division of powers among the three branches of government: an executive, a legislative, and a judicial. According to the Federalist Papers, which you may know was a set of papers that were published in conjunction with the consideration of the Constitution, a kind of a PR effort by the constitutional delegates to try to win approval. One of the things the Federalist Papers did was to try to explain what the Constitution would do if it was adopted. So it's a pretty handy guide for seeing at least what the folks who wrote the Constitution intended. According to the Federalist Papers, the framers intended this system of checks and balances to ensure that no one part of the government would become so powerful as to endanger rule by the people, or democracy, if you wish to refer to it in that way. They clearly believed that that was one of the flaws that had befallen their British system. An executive branch that had become so overpowerful as to effectively deny any real opportunities for expression of the public will. Okay. In the years since the attack, fast forward now, in the years since the attacks of September 11, 2001, how old were you guys when that happened, students? Yeah, so that's a long time ago for you. In the years since the attacks of September 11, 2001, and the ensuing war on terror, and most recently with the uprisings associated with the Arab Spring of 2011, there's been much debate and discussion here in the United States of what constitutes the proper workings of constitutional checks and balances in the formulation and execution of foreign and national security policy. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for me, because it gives me a topic, but unfortunately I think for most of the pundits holding forth on these constitutional issues seem to treat them as if they are modern problems arising from the special circumstances of the Cold War, or even born in the dust of the World Trade Center in some cases. Today I wish to invite you to see those issues as an enduring part of America's constitutional history, that date from the very beginnings of our republic, and that continue to shape the operation of our democracy today. And in that effort. Let me see if I can make this thing work. Constitutional powers of the President in foreign and national security policy. I've just excerpted what I consider to be the most important ones from all from Article 2 of the Constitution. Just to review, I mean, I know you're all familiar with the Constitution's wording because we have this civics requirement in the general education model, so we'll all be educated in that regard. But it never hurts to review. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States and of the militia. He shall have the power to make treaties. He has the power to appoint ambassadors and to receive ambassadors from foreign countries and heads of state. So that's one side of the balance, because really it's primarily the President's prerogative and Congress's prerogative to exercise these balanced powers with regard to national security and foreign policy. Oops, not too far. Okay. Constitutional powers of Congress. Well, this is not, okay, there we go. Yeah, in foreign policy. To provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, common defense there, to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulations of the land and naval forces, to provide for the calling forth of the militia, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. Those are all from Article 2, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, which really is just a long grocery list of powers that Congress has. So I think you can see, when the Federalist Papers said that there really is the intention that these powers be shared, you can see that there is a sharing design in the original document. The problem is it's a little vague around the edges about some important things, like what qualifies as a war, and where are the limits of being commander-in-chief. But it's a short document. I mean, the United States Constitution, relatively speaking, is a short document. So there are lots of these passages that are left to be fleshed out by later experience and statutory action. But this rather vague arrangement of powers with regard to foreign and national security policy creates an invitation for the two branches to struggle over control of foreign and national security policy. And I think I can illustrate for you today that has in fact been the case since the very earliest days of the Republic. Why leave such an important power so vague? I think that probably the easiest answer, perhaps the most, for folks that study the Constitution, perhaps the most compelling answer simply is that in the rush to write the document, and it was rushed, most of the body of the Constitution, certainly the parts with regard to national security policy that you're reading on the overhead slides, were written in 2 weeks by a group of 5 men, not all the delegates to the convention, working in secret. Most of the delegates didn't see that part of the text until it was all ready to come together, as a more complete document. There was really very limited time for full discussion. One reason. Second reason, everybody knew who the first president was going to be. I mean, everybody at the Constitutional Convention felt that they knew who the first president was going to be, George Washington, and they were all comfortable with him as a commander-in-chief, and this probably made it easier for them to leave these boundaries vague, trusting as they did Washington to figure out, the mechanics of how to work with Congress. That part's supposition, though, I think, because we have very little direct evidence of what went on in the minds of the people that wrote the Constitution beyond their own personal remembrances, which you've got to take with a grain of salt, since many of them were ambitious men aspiring to political careers of their own. Their recollections sometimes tend to be colored by the necessities of what they hope to accomplish after the Constitutional Convention. Okay, one great myth of constitutional history. that it was only during the post-1960 era of the Imperial President that this rather vague arrangement came to unsettle the Constitution's balance of power. I think that that myth is really born during the Watergate era. There was much criticism heaped on the notion of what came to be called an imperial president. That was the early 1970s, okay. Of what came to be called an imperial presidency, with the notion that quite recently the presidency had become overpowerful and was seeking to, dominate the control of the national government, both domestically and in foreign policy. Today's scholars, people my age that are working in the field of the presidency, that's when we were having our first contact with the American political process. And so the scholars of the early 1970s were our teachers. And so I think there's a sort of a legacy there of continuing that mythology. The constitutional reality, I think, is, if we just look at the history and not the politics of it, is that from the beginning of the Republic, the presidency's been relatively advantaged in the control in the struggle to control foreign and national security policy. The vagueness of the command power has created all kinds of opportunities for presidents, both strong and weak politically, presidents, to expand their authority into these gray areas around the edges of their delegated powers. Aided somewhat by the penultimate spokesman for unrestricted presidential power, not Richard Nixon, but Theodore Roosevelt, the first president of the 20th century, who took every opportunity he had to enunciate what he called the stewardship theory of the presidency. In a nutshell, Roosevelt's stewardship theory of the presidency, which is at least now almost 112 years old, is essentially that presidents have the power to do whatever they can get away with. Anything that's not strictly prohibited by the Constitution and that does not result in their impeachment and removal is permitted, so long as the president believes that it is required in order to protect the interests of the nation, as he understands them, or she. So this notion, and in Roosevelt's case, he really believed that this was an inherent power. Inherent powers are different than powers given by the Constitution. They exist independent of constitutionality and rest with the requirements of what it means to be a nation state. So Roosevelt's claim of power is extra-constitutional. It doesn't really depend on any specific grant in the document itself or in any Supreme Court interpretation of that document. And so he's in the post-Cold War era. I think Theodore Roosevelt has enjoyed sort of a renaissance among presidential scholars. And as there have been at least a half a dozen biographies of Teddy Roosevelt published since 1995. Good biographies of him published since then. And so that has brought his notion of the stewardship theory sort of into the modern era. And perhaps that accounts for the confusion about where this notion begins. Into the Cold War, we're talking about this Roosevelt theory of presidential power. The two sort of blend together in people's minds. So the point that I wanted to make about Roosevelt is that when he talked about the stewardship theory, he wasn't inventing a notion. He was giving voice to a reality that had been the case for the previous 100 years. The first president that I think I can point to by historic record, to claim that inherent power is not under the stewardship theory, is not Teddy Roosevelt, but Thomas Jefferson. And so what Roosevelt, who fancied himself to be quite an amateur historian, what he was articulating was his understanding of the way things have always been in the American Republic, rather than stating a new theory of presidential power. So I'm interested in espionage and intelligence organizations, and so when it comes to illustrating foreign and national security policy, it's more convenient, in some ways maybe more colorful, but it's more convenient for me to use these sort of operations. They lie at the very edge of presidential authority under foreign and national security policy. Espionage is simply what most people mean by spying. Finding secrets from other countries that people don't want you to know about and stealing them. Obtaining them in order to promote your own nation's interests. Covert action is a little more complex concept, which simply involves secret operations that are designed to cause things to happen without it being clear who caused them.
How is that constitutional, though?
Oh, I hope that will help. I think the fact that that's in the gray area of what is constitutional will help me illustrate the stewardship theory of the presidency and how old it is. We'll see. Constitutional paradox. Over time, the rise of espionage and covert action have greatly expanded the role and power of the presidency in foreign policy. That's an assertion that I think I can demonstrate. This evolution has further eroded the system of checks and balances and largely negated the possibility of public accountability for public policy makers with regard to foreign policy. I think both of those things are true and not necessarily good things, but they are my hypothesis for purposes of this presentation. It's a myth that the rise of presidential supremacy in foreign policy and national security policy are the products of the post-1960 era of the Imperial Presidency. In fact, the tilt toward presidential supremacy begins much earlier than that, out of constitutional vagueness, egged on by the notion of inherent powers for heads of state. And this process of change in the balance of powers has been underway since the dawn of the Republic. I date it from 1800. So selected vignettes to make that case clearer, and maybe give you something to talk about in discussion. Thomas Jefferson, he's the guy at the top there. That's from the I think that's from the National Archives. The painting in the lower right-hand corner is a painting of a major American warship burning to the waterline in the harbor at Tripoli. Jefferson's the commander-in-chief when that event happened. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson's taken the oath of office in March. In April, the Pasha of Tripoli declared war on the United States. He did this in the traditional Tripolitan fashion. He showed up with a cavalry unit at the American consulate in Tripoli, strode into the courtyard, cut down the American flag, and urinated on it, and then left. The American delegation there communicated back to Washington that, as they understood it, we were now at war with the Pasha's military. The point of contention really predated Jefferson's presidency, but he inherited the conflict. The Pasha had only one natural resource at his disposal, and that was a long coastline along a very busy shipping route in the Mediterranean. And he chose to make the most money he could from this arrangement by doing two things. First, he allowed the Barbary pirates to take harbor in Tripolitan ports. They were folks who raided commercial shipping, stole stuff. not unlike the Somalian pirates that we occasionally hear about today in the news. So they would seize cargoes, they would seize sailors, especially officers and civilian passengers, and then ransom them, for money. So he ran that game, and then the Pasha also ran a sort of a protection racket. In exchange for nations paying him large sums of money, preferably in gold, he would arrange for the Barbary pirates not to target flag vessels of that country. So Great Britain, for example, paid huge bribes to the Pasha, and in return, British flagged vessels were not harassed as they passed the Libyan coast. Jefferson, and more directly his predecessor, Adams, refused to pay the bribe. And therefore, American vessels didn't enjoy the protection of the Pasha. When some Americans were seized and offered for ransom, Jefferson, after this rather colorful declaration of war, Jefferson sent American naval frigates to try to shut down the harbor at Tripoli and see if they couldn't recover the American hostages. It didn't go very well. The American Navy was fine, but they didn't know the waters well. And of course the Barbary pirates made their living there, and so that had an unfortunate outcome. That's the schooner, the USS Enterprise. And so in 1802, in light of this, this unfolding drama, Jefferson was faced with a dual dilemma. On the one hand, he was trying to balance the budget. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? He had inherited a large debt from his predecessor. That also sounds familiar. His challenge, of course, was that the Revolutionary War debt was still looming. How to pay off that debt and also protect America's commercial interests, specifically in the Mediterranean. And so if the dispatch of naval vessels was an unreliable solution, Jefferson chose another route. He hired himself an American, I guess, what do we call them? Adventurer. That's what they called them in the 19th century. We'd call them mercenaries. He hired an American mercenary who had been involved in a variety of questionable activities across the Middle East to organize an effort to overthrow the government of the Pasha of Tripoli. And this American mercenary recognized that the best way to do that was to take advantage of the fact that the Pasha was not the rightful ruler of Tripoli. He had a brother who was actually older than him, who he had pushed off of the throne. He waited until he went abroad to visit, and then issued orders that if he came home, he'd be killed. So his brother was cooling his heels in Egypt in exile. It was a comfortable exile, but the throne should have been his. So the idea of this covert operation was to simply take a small group of American troops, 10 United States Marines, by the way, the first Marines to serve in combat overseas for the United States, and send them with this American mercenary for the purpose of attempting to enlist the support of the Pasha's brother in a coup that would overthrow the government. They were successful. I mean, they found the rightful heir to the Tripolitan throne. They found him bitter about his exile, and they convinced him that they had enough money they could hire him a professional military force, which the United States Marines would then lead across the Egyptian border through the Libyan desert to attack Tripoli and seize control of the throne. And all he had to do in return was agree that once that had happened, he would stop harassing our shipping. Seemed cool to him. He signed on. Using money supplied covertly by the United States President from a secret contingency fund set aside by Congress for things that they'd rather not know about. Jefferson provided for the hiring of this mercenary force. They crossed the Libyan desert, no small feat to accomplish, especially for a force not formally a military unit. They fought two important battles in eastern Libya, won them both, seized a major city, and then the Pasha decided that it would be a good idea to take back his declaration of war, release the Americans, and agree not to further harass American shipping. America's first covert paramilitary operation, undertaken by America's third president, all without the permission of Congress and without informing Congress. The president took executive action. He also authorized American military forces to operate out of uniform in a military action in a foreign country. Something that's not really done in official channels. Two of those Marines were killed in the course of the conflict and became America's first foreign military casualties. But the mission was accomplished. About a year after the Pasha had thought better of his declaration of war, the word leaked out that the Pasha, who by the way his name was Yosef Karamani, that his brother was Hamid, had effectively been recruited to function as agents of the United States government by this adventurer, a fellow by the name of William Eaton, who had operated as Thomas Jefferson's first covert warrior overseas. Eaton later wrote a book about it, which sold well in the United States, and the operation was generally either viewed as contemptuous for the Constitution, that would be by Jefferson's political opponents, or as true genius, that would be the Jeffersonian Republican view of the operation. But it established an interesting precedent for inherent powers exercised by chief executives. I thought Teddy Roosevelt might be worth mentioning, since he is often credited as the father of the stewardship theory, although I think we've established that really isn't true. He was simply enunciating an already well-established notion. That's TR. That's a shot of an American battleship passing through the Panama Canal back before battleships got too big to pass through the Panama. You can see it's kind of a tight fit there, passing through one of the locks of the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal became an American enterprise, and its success became perhaps the most important military, gave the United States perhaps the most important military advantage in the first half of the 20th century. All because of the willingness of our President Roosevelt to, how should we say it, act beyond what most people understood to be the limits of presidential authority in foreign and national security affairs. He didn't do it alone, obviously. He had help from men such as J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan's lawyer, a fellow named Cromwell, Nelson Cromwell. But there were at least two ongoing attempts to build canals across the isthmus of Central America. Neither one of them, one by the French, one by the British, neither one of them was having much success as Roosevelt came to the presidency. In fact, the French effort had gone bankrupt in the jungles. But Roosevelt's point was that we needed a canal. His first inclination was to try to negotiate an independent arrangement with Nicaragua. Most people thought Nicaragua was where you should build a canal because the isthmus was thinnest there. It involved the least amount of digging. It's like trying to buy real estate after everybody figures out that a piece of property is the right place to put a business. You find out the price goes up quite a bit. And the Nicaraguans had figured out that their location would make the most sense to the United States' effort. And they attached a lot of conditions, raised the price exorbitantly, and eventually, even though the Roosevelt administration reached an agreement with the Nicaraguan government to buy the right-of-way to construct an Isthmian canal, the legislature, the Nicaraguan legislature, refused to ratify it. Very frustrating for Roosevelt. Their system was based on ours. And treaties signed by their president had to be ratified by their Senate. And the senators wouldn't ratify it because they wanted more money from the United States. And they didn't want to give up the right. See, the United States wanted the right to defend the canal, to put troops there in the event of hostilities. They didn't like the idea of American troops coming into their country, under any circumstances. So they turned it down. In the face of that, embarrassment and failure, Roosevelt solicited another plan for constructing the canal using a Colombian route through what we know of today as Panama, which was really just a southern province of Colombia at that time. The problem was the Colombians didn't want to negotiate with the United States, and so Teddy Roosevelt organized and planned and executed a coup designed in his name without his official approval, which overthrew the government of Colombia in the province of Panama and allowed us to construct the canal. Essentially, what Roosevelt did was to approach J.P. Morgan, a wealthy American industrialist, who ran a railroad through the Panamanian province carrying freight across the isthmus. Well, Morgan was smart enough to realize that if the canal were built near his railroad, he would make a lot more money transporting all the workers and equipment necessary for maintaining the canal. And as it grew into a population center, his railroad would become much more valuable. And so Morgan helped the president to organize a group of Americans living in the province of Panama to, I guess to make a long story short, to incite a rebellion, or to incite what would appear to be a rebellion. They bought the cooperation of some Colombian military forces, a small number, that were native to the Colombian province. Colombia always chafed at the notion of being part of Colombia and had sought to separate themselves a couple of times before, but never had any support from the United States until now. And so the coup came off. The Colombians discovered too late that sitting offshore, just out of sight, was a small American naval flotilla loaded with United States Marines under the command of a captain named Lejeune. And so as soon as the telegraph word was received from the Americans in Panama that the uprising had begun, Roosevelt cabled back diplomatic recognition for the new country of Panama and sent Lejeune's Marines ashore. They formed a protected corridor around the province to keep the Colombians from taking it back, and 2 months later we began building the canal. Over top of a site that the French had failed in their construction effort to complete. The Colombians are still a little bitter about that, as you might imagine. But the point was that operation remained secret until 10 years after Teddy Roosevelt left office. He himself described it in a commencement address. I think it may have been at Stanford, but I'm not sure. Explaining what he had done, and so all the earmarks of a covert operation it was designed to be secret. It was designed to deceive folks about what happened. It was designed to accomplish an objective of the United States' foreign and national security policy without the hand of the United States becoming apparent. it succeeded. And that is a good illustration of what Roosevelt meant when he talked about the inherent power of the presidency. He thought it was in the best interest of the United States to do this. He didn't ask Congress. He didn't report to them. He sought funding from an outside source J.P. Morgan, who shared an economic interest in the president's covert operation. Franklin Roosevelt, a relative of Teddy, and banner at the bottom there is of the Italian liberation movement during World War II. Was the official banner adopted by the non-communist Italian partisan movement that were interested in trying to throw the Nazis out of the Nazi-influenced fascist government out of power in Italy during World War II. Didn't see too much of it at the first of the war because it was especially dangerous. Roosevelt, Franklin, had a problem with regard to Italy and operations there. As World War II wore on, the problem was that it appeared clear to him that the way the war was going, the United States was going, the Allies were going to win. The question is, what would come after? And in Italy, it looked very much like communist sympathizing partisans who were having the most success fighting the Germans and enjoyed the deepest popular support in lots of important regions, especially in the north of Italy, would probably come to power. And Italy would become a communist state by popular election. This was also, by the way, a problem in France that the president was looking at. His solution, though, in Italy was unique and secret, and illustrates a further expansion, I think, of the stewardship theory of the presidency. At the beginning of the war, Roosevelt had created an organization you sometimes hear about, I guess, in history and movies, called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. Had originally been created as the Office of Information before the war, but moved into defense operations after the war started. To prepare for Roosevelt's notion of a covert operation in Italy, the OSS formed its first foreign forces operational groups to carry out black operations in the Mediterranean and the Balkans between 1943 and 1945. These were, technically speaking, not operations that targeted the Germans or the Italian fascists. These operational groups' mission was to kill Italian communists, who were, technically speaking, on our side and fighting against the Germans. You can see how it would be a little dicey, operationally, to try to keep the Soviet Union in the American and British alliance at the same time that you are attempting to kill their partisans in the field, and also their intelligence officers who were inevitably in the field as liaison officers with these partisan groups. In Sicily, for example, the OSS operational group was composed primarily of, well, what would be a good name for them? American criminals released from prisons. The OSS showed preference for the mafia, the Sicilian mafia, because they had local knowledge, and also the Purple Gang, an American, Italian, primarily Italian criminal organization. These operational groups were essentially infiltrated into Italy in advance of the American invasion, so that they would be at the front end, ahead of any American force movement. And their job was to eliminate, I guess that'd be a good way to say it, selected targets that were responsible for leading the socialists and communist partisans in Italy. And to effectively, once the American invasion began, give the Americans the opportunity to really take full control of the territory that they conquered. Same in the Balkans. Same strategy. Communist rebels and partisans were the target of OSS operational groups. We weren't there killing Germans, although we did kill some Germans. We weren't there killing Germans. We were there killing communist partisans and their NKVD, that was the Russian Secret Service, coordinators in the field, and using individuals who, if they were killed or captured, would be completely deniable to the United States. And so Roosevelt's taken the idea of the stewardship theory and inherent power of the presidency here to act against American allies militarily when he deemed it to be appropriate, without seeking any congressional authorization, without reporting that activity to the Congress or any other body. So I think, in conclusion, the constitutional paradoxes that are associated with espionage and covert action are, I think we've shown, almost as old as the Constitution itself. The Constitution signed in 1787, September 1787, ratified the next year in 1788. The first well-documented use of covert action in foreign policy, 1800, 1801. So these sorts of actions by presidents claiming inherent power have fueled the growth of presidential dominance in foreign and national security policy, and in the process they have fundamentally transformed American democracy. The United States today, unlike in 1800, is a system characterized by a strong executive branch, an executive branch that's much stronger than the other two branches. That clearly wasn't the system that was envisioned in the Federalist Papers, but it is where things evolved to. This is not a modern phenomenon. It's taken 200 years plus for it to reach the current point. So that's what I have for you. Floor is open for discussion. We got a few minutes before it's 20 till before we have to get the room up. So, yes, sir.
So the idea of inherent powers, I'm curious if that's related to the tradition of social contract thinking. I mean, it sounds kind of like Hobbes saying, well, the nation still exists in a kind of state of nature where everybody's at war with each other, so you can do whatever you want. Is there any, I mean, where does the idea of inherent powers come from?
The idea of inherent powers?
Yeah, I mean, is
it's an international law concept that dates from the Treaty of Worms. The notion that nation states are entities, living and breathing entities, and as such have a right to protect themselves, meaning that they can do whatever they have to do in order to protect their sovereignty.
Right.
And so, yeah, and it is that's a very Hobbesian point of view. I mean, the idea of international relations is always one of chaos. I mean, nations exist within a world order which is effectively defined by chaos, and their challenge is to try to, survive. So that is a very Hobbesian concept. Yes, sir.
How do international organizations like the United Nations and the fact that has a police force and actions taken by them affect our foreign policy? And I'm thinking about this with something like the Korean conflict, which was not technically a war, was it?
Well, I guess no.
It was a police action.
It wasn't a war.
It was what was called a police action,
So-
like Vietnam.
Yeah. So
Was a United Nations police action.
And it was largely, I mean,
95% of the people who fought in Vietnam on the UN side were Americans.
Yeah.
Most of the people who fought in Korea, not that high percentage, but most of the people who fought in the Korean War on the United Nations side were Americans. The United Nations in that period becomes a sort of a proxy for American foreign policy interests.
Does the executive branch tend to take advantage of that more than other?
Well, I think there's an arc of evolution there. I mean, during the 1950s and 60s and into the 1970s, from from Vietnam and Korea to places like Angola. I think you see American presidents using the United Nations Charter as a sort of cover for pursuing overt, not covert, but
Yes.
overt military operations overseas. They're really American inspired operations. That begins to change after Vietnam because the structure of the United Nations changes in the General Assembly. And General Assemblies assert more authority over United Nations resolution action. And so the use of police forces, typically now requires some authorization from the General Assembly. And so the United Nations becomes a bit more independent. United Nations forces deploy to the Balkans before the United States gets involved in the Clinton administration. The United States joined that operation, but we didn't begin it. And so that's a more independent United Nations. Yes?
Couldn't it be argued that the president has less power now in that there are committee members, there are members of Congress who are on committees that regulate CIA and FBI? So, couldn't we say that they can't do as many of those, or not, they can't do as many, but the power doesn't all rest on the president's shoulders in terms of covert ops?
Well, one of the fallouts of the Watergate era was the establishment of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. Eventually. It didn't happen immediately, but eventually. And those committees were given certain responsibilities, and presidents were asked to begin reporting uses of covert operations and espionage operations overseas to those committees. And some presidents have complied in a limited sense. But since the operations are secret, if a president chooses not to comply, Ronald Reagan, for example, decides to kill Muammar Gaddafi in the 1980s with a pre-planned military strike on his headquarters. They missed. They did hit the French embassy by accident, which made it perhaps even more news. But Reagan decided the best way to go with Congress was to comply fully with the act. And so a courier arrived on the doorstep of the chairman of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees at like 3 o'clock in the morning, Washington, D.C. time, as the first bombs were exploding, with official presidential notification that the president had signed a finding authorizing the conduct of an American military operation against Muammar Gaddafi. He was in full compliance with the law, and Congress had no role whatsoever in the operation. Yeah. What about Iran-Contra? Well, Iran-Contra is the term, is a sort of a label for a long series of some secret and some not so secret military operations. But it illustrates my point, I think. Well, what starts the Iran-Contra Scandal, as Reagan scholars have come to see it, was that Congress wanted very badly to stop President Reagan from supporting the Nicaraguan Contras, who were the military remnants of a previously displaced government, who were operating from exile across national borders into their old country and conducting what you and I might describe as terror operations against military and civilian populations. The United States, the Reagan administration, adopted them because they were doing what we very much wanted to do, which was to overthrow the socialist government of Nicaragua and replace it with one that would be more friendly to us. And Congress did not want that to happen, and so they passed a law which says specifically you cannot fund, you can't spend any American money, no government money to fund this operation. And so what the Reagan administration did was to begin to sell surplus American weapons to the Iranian government and take the money and put it in a Swiss bank account to launder it and then use it to pay for the operations of the Nicaraguan Contras. Eventually they got caught, but it was only by accident. A CIA-owned plane gets shot down over Nicaraguan territory. The only survivor is a fellow named Hassan Fass, who was a former CIA employee who was a kicker on the flight, the guy that kicks the cargo out of the bay door. He survived. He was low enough on the food chain that the CIA wasn't willing to do anything to try to get him back. So he told the story about what was going on. And that's how the Iran-Contra scandal became a scandal. But there again, the Reagan administration simply, well, they did what Thomas Jefferson did. They sought outside money. I mean, they went from door to door among conservative, anti-communist Americans asking for personal contributions to support the Contras. It's only when they couldn't get enough money that way to do what they wanted to do that they began selling the weapons to Iran, you know, to supplement their income.
According to Time magazine, this week, the cost of the war in Iraq was $3.3 trillion and more than 5,250 Americans lost life, and they moved dictator Saddam. Whereas in Libya, it cost $1 billion, less than $1 billion, and no American lost life, with the same objective to move Gaddafi. Who made the decision for Iraq? Congress made the decision, or Mr. President made the decision?
No, that was an executive choice. It was eventually endorsed by Congress. There was a joint resolution passed in the House and the Senate endorsing the President's use of military force in Iraq before American troops crossed the Kuwaiti border into the country. So it wasn't a declaration of war, it was simply an endorsement of military action. And the argument there was that the Hussein regime was in violation of a United Nations protocol, which forbade the development of certain kinds of weapons. Thus, the obsession today with, you know, whether there really were any weapons of mass destruction, because it was the allegation of weapons of mass destruction being developed by the Iraqis that gave the United States the legal authority to enforce that UN mandate. It now appears that most of that intelligence either didn't exist or had not been correctly interpreted. And so, of course, one of the interesting things about the American executive in this paradoxical situation is they're the finder of fact. American intelligence agencies collect the information that determine whether the American intelligence agencies have the right to act. So that gives them a bit of an inside, straight in terms of controlling the outcome of deliberations. But in fairness, I mean, a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans voted in favor of that resolution to use military force in Iraq. And it turned out to be very expensive in all kinds of ways. That's an illustration. Presidents do have a considerable authority to drum up support for operations that they want to carry out when they choose to go that way. But they also have a tremendous capacity to act unilaterally when they choose not to seek public or congressional authority. That's the residue of the really strong executive. The United States government has become one characterized by a really strong executive. Now the question is, how much longer does that continue to be a democracy? Yes?
With the release of WikiLeaks, do you think it's weakened the president's position?
Well, it certainly embarrassed some former presidents, I think. WikiLeaks the documents that were obtained by an American soldier, I guess, and made available to the WikiLeaks organization are essentially diplomatic cables from American ambassadors overseas commenting on, the political situations in different countries around the world. Those cables are supposed to be confidential, presidential communications. So yeah, surely it embarrasses those administrations. The Obama administration limited exposure to it because they hadn't been in power. Okay.